I'm Tom from GTT. I'm joined today by Mathieu from Aruba. We'll introduce ourselves a bit more in a second. And what we're talking about today is optimizing for a hybrid workforce with SD-WAN. So a bit about us. As I say, I'm Tom from GTT. GTT, if you're not familiar with us, we're a cloud networking company. We have specialized in providing a tier 1 IP backbone for many years, and we, over the last 5 to 10 years, like a lot of IP backbone providers, have really specialized in managed services, complex managed services, SD-WAN, security, and other associated technologies which sit alongside our IP backbone. My responsibility is for our pre-sales community in Europe, so I have a team of 40 or so engineers who work with organizations like yours on their connectivity, security, and managed services needs.
And I'm Mathieu Berrjeb. I'm a systems engineer at Aruba, following the acquisition of Silverpeak. So I've been about 3 years ago. I've been there for 3 years. And before that, my career has been mainly around service providers in the product and pre-sales capacity.
GTT and Aruba have had a long-standing partnership from the Silverpeak days. And what we're going to do today is talk you through a use case of an organization we've worked with together, GTT and Aruba, over the last 4 or 5 years. We're going to talk about our initial engagement with them and some of the changes they've been through in the way that almost all of us will have been through in the last few years, responding to the changing work landscape. Talk a bit about the process we went through. We'll explain the solution that we initially proposed, kind of how that's changed as their requirements have changed over the last few years, and what we've learned as we've been through that process. So, what organisation are we talking about? Well, I will protect their anonymity, but describe them to you in as much detail as I can. They are a fully global organisation. Their business is manufacturing car parts for a full range of car manufacturers. If you came here in a car today, it's likely you used their technology to get to this hotel. They're headquartered in Germany, but have offices and factories all over the world. For the kind of office footprint or the location footprint is kind of as you might expect. They have large manufacturing facilities in China and various other places in the Far East, and they have sales offices all over the world in all 6 major inhabited continents, and kind of distribution locations as well in each of those locations. So a very, very global footprint. Some of those locations, as you know, are areas which have traditionally been fairly complicated to operate in for various connectivity reasons, which presented some challenges. They, as an organisation, have had a long-standing relationship with national incumbents, so they tended to buy from national incumbents in each location and try and stitch those networks together themselves, which is a common scenario we see. And they first approached us in 2017. We'll talk through what the situation they're in a second when they came to us. And clearly, as we've been on a journey with them, their requirements have changed significantly in that period. Their internal IT team, very experienced, very expert, as I'm sure is the case for lots of you here today. But there was no shortage of managed network expertise in the client when we first met with them. So what were their challenges specifically? Hopefully some of this, if not all of this, will ring true for some of your organisations today. But when they came to us, they had several existing legacy and private networks, MPLS networks. They were extremely high cost because they were tied into buying circuits and all around the world from a smaller subset of players. And then they had a complex job integrating those various disparate networks with their IT team. They, as I said, because they were tied into buying circuits from a single provider or a small number of providers. They had very limited flexibility in terms of the underlying access provider and access technology. So if they wanted to get 4G or satellite or similar in some of their more hard-to-reach locations, they often struggled to source those. And on top of that complex source of underlying connectivity, their internal team had deployed another in-house managed layer of complexity with a DMVM product. Those disparate networks meant they had very limited visibility, so they had a series of kind of point solutions. They went to their MPLS provider in Asia, the MPLS provider in Europe, and bought something different from each of them, which meant that they could see some stats over here and not over here, and it was a real inconsistent mess, which was the main thing that first brought them to us. That they didn't know what they didn't know, and that's a key thing that we'll touch on later. That lack of visibility led to an inconsistent security posture. There's a parallel CIO and CISO tracks here, but we all know how much they intertwine. And complexity is the enemy of security, as they say. This organization has very valuable intellectual property, and they take security very seriously, as we all do, but they were concerned about the lack of visibility leading to the inconsistent point solutions and what that meant for their platform. And lastly, they were, in 2017, in the early stages of a big shift to cloud. I'm sure by now a lot of you will have been through this with your organization, but they were publicly declaring their cloud-first strategy and in the process of moving workloads. So they knew that the application the application estate they had today was not the application estate they would have in 2 years, and they were committing to us for a fairly lengthy contract. They needed to know that they needed us to know that their application estate would be changing. While they had a very experienced IT team, and they were very experienced at managing networks, the cloud management and the procurement of cloud services was a new area for them. That was an area they had to upskill, which was a fairly significant new line of business for them. So this is the process we went through, and this is the process we go through with kind of any of our new organizations coming to us to talk about SD-WAN. And the first step is understanding the business strategy. Be wary of any provider who comes to you and starts immediately talking technology without trying to find out a bit about what you're doing as a business. For this organization, it was about growth into new markets. It was about cost saving. It was about centralization and ultimately simplification of their disparate IT teams so that they have more central control. Step 2 is fundamental and something we'll come back to later, but the understanding what they had was key. And as we explained in the kind of problem area, they had a real visibility issue. So they didn't necessarily know what applications they had, but building that idea of the application footprint is fundamental. And if you don't know what you have, it's difficult to design what you need. Often we find working with organizations, and as was the case here, they had a very clear image in their mind of what they thought, how they thought their network ran, and when they put it into practice and deployed some of our technology, they realized it wasn't quite like that at all. That flows into point 3 about how is that application landscape changing. As we touched on, they are moving to cloud. There was a huge shift to cloud workloads, which meant that the application estate was changing over time, and they needed to plan for the future as well as today. What my team do when we work with organizations like yours is go through this process and then try and break up your full estate into site types. This is a gold, silver, bronze site, or this is a big office, a small office, and a factory, or and it's an oversimplification. But generally, we try and group sites together to come up with a simpler offering as much as possible. And we define those as site types and then model really what we think the bandwidth requirements are in a given location. This particular client, they had one particular site where they had, generally about 200 or 300 meg of regular traffic that peaked at 600 meg every now and then, so they had a 1 gig circuit. And next to it, completely passive, they had another 1 gig circuit. So they had 2 gig of bandwidth at a reasonably large location for average traffic of 300 or 400 meg. So what we try and do is model actually what you need rather than just replicating what you have if it's not right for the future. That flows into commercials and project plan and defining how we fail over and things. And that was a complex discussion for this client, but ultimately successful, as we'll see. And then we start the project and go from there. So this is what we delivered them. Again, a fairly simplified diagram, but we delivered them GTT-provided Aruba Edge Connect. In 2017, it was Silver Peak Edge Connect. GTT Interroute, as was, has significant experience deploying SD-WAN and was one of the first to deploy it on the universal CPE, which is what we did here. So we were deploying Aruba Edge Connect virtual devices on GTT-managed UCPEs. One of the key deciding points for using Aruba in this scenario was their boost technology, their WAN acceleration technology. In some of those complex parts of the world that I mentioned, that was key to delivering the performance they needed. And we delivered DIA, standard dedicated internet, alongside the legacy MPLS they had. As I said, they had MPLS in lots of different providers in far parts of the world, and they all had different contract rates, a ragged edge, as we call it in contract terms. So what we did was we put the DIA alongside it. We allowed the two to run in parallel. We allowed the Aruba Edge Connect box to work its magic and send the traffic down the correct path at the right time. And as and when those legacy MPLS links came end of contract, we ripped them out, and all of this was almost invisible to the users because the Edge Connect box would reprioritize accordingly. We integrated a managed firewall on those UCPEs, as I talked about, and deployed the same technology in the center of our network as a network firewall. One of the reasons we do so much work with Aruba is that it allows us to service chain market-leading technologies from different vendors. So in this situation, actually, we deployed Palo Alto firewalls alongside Aruba Edge Connect and used that same Palo Alto technology to provide access for remote users. And recently, we've also added SIP. So what changed at the start of last year? Well, some of this is fairly obvious, and I'm sure a lot of you went through the same process, but all those global sales offices, they effectively closed, and those locations started working from home. This is, I'm sure, consistent and familiar to lots of you. That meant enormous increase in bandwidth at the central firewall and complete removal of bandwidth at the edge in their field locations. Yeah, an interesting problem they had actually, though, was they had factories where they were producing equipment that they couldn't close down, and people still had to go and work there, but they needed to be able to deliver completely reliable connectivity where in those locations to allow people to remotely manage some of that production equipment, some of that factory equipment. Like all of us, they had significant revenue and supply chain uncertainty. They're providing parts for the car manufacturing industry. That was not an industry that was flourishing in lockdown. So that was an issue for them, but they also had uncertainty about the components they needed. And that huge increase of video conferencing meant that their bandwidth requirements changed. So what we did for them is we effectively moved bandwidth around. And this is a model that we're seeing a lot more with our clients, which is organizations like yours want flexibility around where their bandwidth is. Something GTT has done for a long time is pool bandwidth regionally. So we allow people to move 100 meg from here to here, and that's exactly what client did in the early parts of 2020. They moved bandwidth from their sales offices to their central DCs to allow for the huge increase in people accessing remotely. That meant we had to upgrade some of those sites and upgrade some of those firewalls to handle that extra throughput. But the moving of the bandwidth around meant that it was in some ways cost neutral for the client. This is defining a major part of our roadmap is as we move towards where we can a full bandwidth on demand type model where we allow organizations like yours to pay as you go for bandwidth and move it around and address demand rather than committing to 3-5 year terms when you can't possibly know what's happening in your business in the next 3 to 5 years. This flows neatly into what we're doing with SASE, which we're not going to talk about today in any detail, but we, as I mentioned earlier, our partnership with Aruba allows us to overlay best-in-class technology. And that's what we're doing with SASE. We're using Aruba's underpinnings with a best-in-class SASE vendor. And this organization is going to be one of the first to trial that technology with us later this year and into early 2022. So over to Mathieu to talk a bit more about what we learned through this process.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Right, so we just wanted to think back about this customer journey and look at some of the lessons that we've learned as a vendor and a service provider. And the first one that I want to discuss relates to cost savings. And I remember talking to many customers for 5 years ago, in the early days of SD-WAN. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions was the fact that they all thought that SD-WAN would be a cheaper replacement to the current network. But the truth is, SD-WAN is just an added cost. And if you simply add your SD-WAN licenses to any type of network, whether it's MPLS, internet, or hybrid, it's always going to be more expensive on day one. The thing is, however, with SD-WAN, with Aruba Edge Connect, we have so many features that help you run your application as best as possible, regardless of the underlying network that you have. And so that when you start looking at those underlays network and you swap some circuits for some more cost-effective ones, that is when you can start realizing some savings. But the other thing to consider is that you get a lot more value from an SD-WAN solution out of the box compared to a traditional, let's say, MPLS. Visibility across your network is something that you can get regardless of the underlay that you have. And in the past, if you try to implement such solution, it would be quite expensive because you had to add this on top of your transport, your providers. The ease of troubleshooting is also very important and very valuable. It is quite easy and very quick to fix the issue these days because of the visibility that SD-WAN gives you. And the quicker you fix an issue, the less impact it has on your business. Therefore, that is something that you can value as well in terms of money. ROI as well. So you need to look at SD-WAN it will give you a better ROI over the years, not just from day one. Okay. When you decrease the amount of downtime that your factories, your offices might have, this is something that will increase your productivity. Or if you remove the maintenance cost of several network devices such as routers, firewalls, one optimization devices, because of the fact that SD-WAN would consolidate all of those functions onto one UCP device in the case of GTT. The other thing that we've realized is that a lot of customers had very little knowledge about the network and very little visibility into the application landscape. And this can, and the reason for that is because in the past, like that customer use case, for instance, they had several different service providers, per region, one in Asia, one in the US, one in Europe. And to get a unified view of all of that, data was quite difficult to achieve, without spending some money to get, a proper visibility solution. And this can have some serious security concerns because what SD-WAN does essentially is expand the security parameters by introducing local breakouts at every locations. And if you don't know what applications your users are using, and you all of a sudden allow all of your users at every location to break out locally to access any sort of applications, you will increase obviously the security threats. It was also an issue in terms of right sizing. So something that we've noticed is that when customer moved from the traditional, let's say, network to an SD-WAN solution, what they would do typically is keep the same bandwidth that they had at every location, just for ease of migration. And sometimes it's good because they get it right, but more often than not, it's wrong. So they either have too much bandwidth, which means they're paying for more than what they need. Again, that relates to cost savings, or they don't have enough. And if they don't have enough, then they have a performance issue. And again, if they have downtime or congestion on the network, this is something that you can translate in terms of savings. And to finish, I just want to talk about the ease of use of an SD-WAN solution. Okay, so obviously SD-WAN by the nature of being software defined, so you have that nice orchestrator, single pane of glass from which you're going to do all of your configuration, your reporting, your monitoring, and so on. It still takes people with the right skill and right experience to get the most out of it. And that is why a lot of the early adopters of SD-WAN, again 4 or 5 years ago, who had decided on a do-it-yourself type of approach, eventually changed their mind and pick the partner with experience like GTT, for instance, to deploy their SD-WAN solution.
If you have any other questions, feel free to stop by our stand. We're just outside, but otherwise, please enjoy your lunch.
Thank you.